I was 28 when everything I thought I knew about my past unraveled in a single afternoon. I was standing by the old fence line with my Husky, Storm, when a county vehicle rolled up my dirt road. The woman who stepped out, a legal liaison I'd never met, held a thick envelope like it carried the weight of a life I didn't remember. "Calder Wynn?" she asked softly. "This came from a law firm in Montana, and you might want to sit down before you open it." In that moment, I felt the ground shift under me. A letter across states unless a buried truth is finally ready to surface. Late July had a way of turning the southern mountains into a mirage, the kind of heat that shimmered above the ridgelines and made even the distant pines look like they were breathing. And on that afternoon, the sky over North Georgia was a hard, polished blue, the kind you see in old photographs of Wyoming and Montana cattle country, all open distance and thin, high clouds that don't promise a thing. The cicadas were already screaming in the hollows, and the dust on the narrow dirt road that wound up to my cabin lay undisturbed, except for my own boot prints and the big, wolfy tracks of my Husky, Storm, shadowing mine like he always did. My name is Calder Wynn, 32 years old, the sort of man folks in town call that mountain guy, if they talk about me at all. Tall and rangy from years of work and walking, shoulders a little too tight from a life that taught me to flinch at sudden noises. My beard is more rust than brown now, shot through with early silver at the chin, and my hair is usually tied back with a leather thong I'd cut from an old belt. Most days I wear the same uniform, scarred brown leather jacket even when it's too hot for it, sun-bleached denim shirt, jeans gone white at the knees, boots that have seen more miles than most people's cars, and a canvas pack that hangs from one shoulder whether I'm heading out or coming home. Once, a lifetime ago, those shoulders carried a different weight. Body armor and someone else's flag, half a world away in a desert that smelled like burnt metal and cordite. And there are nights the sound of mortar fire still crawls through my sleep. But up here, I've learned to swap one kind of silence for another. No sirens, no engines, just the wind running fingers through the trees and the low, steady breathing of the dog stretched at my feet. Storm is 3 years old now, big for a Husky, with a thick gray and white coat that never quite sheds enough for summer, ice blue eyes that miss nothing, and a habit of tilting his head as if the world is telling him secrets only he can hear. He's part guardian, part mirror, part ghost from some older world where men didn't last long without a good dog beside them. I found him as a half-starved pup outside a gas station when I was drifting between jobs after the army, ribs showing through that fur and one paw still too big for the rest of him. And from the moment he decided to climb into the bed of my truck without asking, I haven't walked a trail alone. Out here, the cabin is little more than a rectangle of weathered pine tucked into a clearing of broom sedge and blackberry bramble, a wood stovepipe stabbing up through the roof, a narrow front porch, and a single dim room smelling of coffee, gun oil, and cedar. Some people would call it lonely, but after the city noise and the crowded barracks and that one failed stretch of almost domestic life with a woman who wanted sidewalks and bright lights, I've come to think of this place as the only kind of home that makes sense. That afternoon, I was leaning on the split rail fence I'd built by hand the first winter I lived here, squinting down the valley at storm haze gathering over the far ridges, and wondering if the rain would finally break the heat, when Storm's ears pricked, and he lifted his head, nostrils flaring as if the air itself had shifted. A faint growl rumbled in his chest, not the kind he gives for trespassing raccoons or the occasional black bear nosing around the trash, but something quieter, puzzled, like he'd caught the scent of another life drifting up the road. A moment later I heard it too, the distant, unfamiliar crunch of tires on gravel, slow and careful, in a way that told me whoever was coming up this road had never driven it before. Up here, I don't get many visitors. The post office box in town keeps most of the world at arm's length, and the folks who know where I live are the sort who honk once and let themselves in. This vehicle, a dusty county SUV, eased around the last curve like it was afraid the mountain might spit it back out. Storm moved closer to me, fur along his spine lifting in a subtle ridge as the SUV rolled to a stop just beyond the fence and the engine cut off. For a second, the only sound was the ticking of hot metal cooling. The woman who stepped out looked like she'd driven a long way to be somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to be. Early 40s, maybe. Dark hair pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck, tan slacks, a pale blouse already sticking to her back with sweat, and sensible shoes that didn't belong on a mountain road. She had a county badge clipped to her belt and a leather satchel slung across her body, and the way she paused to take in the cabin, the fence, the dog, and me, said she was cataloguing everything, not as a threat, but as details in a story she'd have to write in some report later. "Mr. Wynne?" she called, shading her eyes with one hand. Her voice carried a practiced calm that told me she'd spent a lot of years talking to people on the worst days of their lives. I pushed off the fence, resting a hand lightly on Storm's head to let him know it was fine, and nodded. Up close I could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the kind put there more by worry than by laughter, and something about the careful way she held herself, straight spine, shoulders back, jaw slightly set, told me she was the type who'd stay in a job long after it started eating at her, because someone had to. "Uncalled her," I said. "You got turned around or something, Ms. "Klein," she supplied. "Miriam Klein, legal liaison for the county. And no, I'm exactly where I meant to be." Her gaze flicked briefly to Storm, who was staring at her with the flat, assessing look he saved for strangers. "He friendly?" "Depends on who you ask," I said. And for the first time she smiled, just a little, enough to soften some of the tension in her shoulders. Then she reached into the satchel and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, edges worn from the trip, the kind of paper that doesn't come from past-due bills or junk mail. Even from a few feet away, I could see the return address stamped in precise black letters. A law firm in Helena, Montana, some name I'd never heard of, with a gold emblem in the corner that caught the light like a coin. Seeing the word Montana there was like catching a flash of another world, a place I had only ever seen on postcards tacked to cafe bulletin boards, all snow-capped peaks and open sky and cattle dots moving slow across endless grass. And for half a heartbeat, I thought maybe she'd parked at the wrong cabin after all. "This came through our office with a request to be hand-delivered," Ms. Klein said, walking up to the fence but keeping that respectful distance, like she understood the way solitude becomes a kind of skin. "It was forwarded from your P.O. box. Certified, restricted delivery. They were very clear it needed to land in your hands and nowhere else." She held the envelope out, but there was something in her face that didn't match the professionalism of her words, a flicker of unease mixed with a curiosity she was trying hard not to show. I'd seen that look before, overseas, on the faces of medics and officers holding folded papers, between wanting to deliver good news and bracing for the moment they broke someone open. My fingers felt clumsy suddenly, but I reached out and took the envelope, the weight of it surprising me. The paper was thick, expensive, embossed with that law firm's crest, and somewhere under the official smell of toner and cardboard there was a faint trace of lavender, like it had passed through hands that still believed in little niceties. My heart was already beating faster, though I couldn't have said why. I didn't know anyone in Montana. As far as I'd ever been told growing up, my mother's people were gone, and my father's side was a handful of headstones in an overgrown cemetery 2 counties over. Mom had worked double shifts at the diner to keep us afloat until the night the police knocked on our old apartment door when I was 16. By the time I got back from the army, whatever thread we'd had to the rest of the world was cut. She never once mentioned a mother of her own, let alone a ranch way out west. "I'm supposed to ask you to sign for it," Ms. Klein said quietly, pulling a clipboard from her satchel. "Standard procedure." Storm pressed closer to my leg as I scribbled my name, his fur hot under my palm, and when Ms. Klein took the board back, she hesitated. "Mr. Wynne, I don't know what's in there, but I've been doing this a long time. People don't send certified envelopes from law firms across the country unless something important shifted somewhere. In my experience, it's either really bad or really good." I tried to make a joke about my luck leaning toward the first category, but the words died on my tongue. Instead, I nodded, thanked her, and watched as she climbed back into the SUV, dust kicking up behind her tires as she eased down the road, leaving me alone again with the trees and the dog and the envelope that suddenly felt heavier than my old rucksack ever had. For a minute, I just stood there, thumb running along the sealed flap, listening to the mountains quiet. A hawk crying high above, the rustle of something small in the underbrush, the distant thump of my own pulse in my ears. Then I walked to the porch, sat down on the top step, and slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a letter on thick stationery and a packet of typed documents neatly clipped together. The letterhead carried the same Helena address as the envelope, and beneath it, in clean, looping script, was a name. Daniel Pierce, attorney at law, the state representative for Ms. Evelyn Hartwell. I had to read that twice. The body of the letter was all formal phrasing and legal clarity, but the pieces arranged themselves in my mind in simpler words. My maternal grandmother, a woman I had never been told existed, had died 3 months earlier in a town I'd never heard of called Lone Willow, Montana. She had owned a 600-hectare cattle ranch there, land that had been in her family for generations, and in a will signed and notarized 2 years ago, she had named me, Calder James Wynne, of no fixed address and no particular prospects, as sole heir to the Hartwell Ranch and all its assets. There was mention of a trust fund, too, money set aside specifically for rebuilding and modernizing the place if I chose to take it on. And then, in a postscript typed separately and signed in a hand that wavered just a little, there was a sentence that didn't read like any lawyer I'd ever heard. "If you are reading this, it means I have gone on ahead, and the land no longer has my boots on it. Do not let it fall into the hands of someone who will not love it." My chest felt tight by the time I got to the end. I'd spent years convinced that whatever blood ran in my veins began and ended with my mother and me, that the rest of the tree had been burned down long before I was born. But here, on this page, was proof of roots I'd never been shown. More than that, there was intent. Somewhere out there, under a bigger sky and wilder weather than these Georgia hills, a woman named Evelyn Hartwell had not only remembered I existed, she had built a future with my name written on it. Storm gave a low whine and nudged my elbow with his nose, and I realized my hands were shaking. I read the line about not letting the ranch fall into the wrong hands again, slower this time. And something in the back of my mind, something old and stubborn that the war and the wandering hadn't managed to kill, sat up and took notice. I didn't know yet about the way folks in Lone Willow were already talking in low voices at the feed store and the diner, about the stranger named Darren Crew who had shown up with a stack of yellowed papers claiming to be Evelyn's long-lost grandnephew. The way he'd moved into the big white farmhouse at the center of all that grass before the ink on the death notice had dried. I didn't know he was busy stripping equipment from the barn, loosening boards from the old corrals and carrying folders full of land valuations into the bank, trying to leverage soil and history into quick cash. All of that was happening hundreds of miles away under a harder sun, while I sat on my porch in North Georgia with a dog at my feet and a letter in my hands, feeling a door I'd thought welded shut swing inward on silent hinges. What I did know was simple and impossible to ignore. For the first time since I'd taken off my uniform and driven into the mountains to disappear, someone, family, had reached out from beyond the grave and offered me more than just survival. They'd offered me a place, a legacy, an invitation. I looked down the road Ms. Klein had taken, then west toward where the land rose and broke and kept on going into states I'd only ever seen on weather maps. In my mind's eye, unbidden and vivid, I saw it. A white ranch house standing alone in a sea of waving grass, fences running like lines on an old palm, cattle dark against gold, the sky over Lone Willow stretching wide enough to hold a man's whole life. Storm followed my gaze, ears twitching, and for a heartbeat, I could have sworn he understood. Somewhere beneath the old scars and the long years of keeping my world as small as this clearing, something shifted. The envelope had done more than deliver news. It had put a question in my hands. And sitting there with the taste of dust and possibility in the air, I realized I already knew the answer. One way or another, I was going to Montana. The road to Lone Willow stretched farther than any map could explain, a ribbon of cracked asphalt running through farmland, desert flats, and long reaches of highway where the sky looked big enough to swallow a man whole. And for the first 2 days of driving, I barely spoke, except a calm storm when thunderheads rolled over the plains. He was restless, shifting his weight in the passenger seat, pressing his nose against the crack of the window each time the wind changed, as if the scent of the West was calling to him in a language older than mine. By the time the third morning broke, Montana had begun to rise in front of us, not with sudden mountains, but with a slow swell of land lifting into hills, then spreading into open ranch country where the grass seemed to breathe under the breeze. Lone Willow showed itself the way small towns do. First a weather-beaten sign leaning at an angle, then a handful of barns, then a single main street lined with false front buildings that looked like they'd been waiting half a century for someone to repaint them. As I eased the truck down the road that led out of town toward the coordinates the lawyer had given me, Storm suddenly raised his head and stared forward with an intensity that pulled my own gaze farther west. And then I saw it. The Hartwell Ranch, my grandmother's ranch, rose from the grasslands like something out of a memory I never lived. A white farmhouse perched on a soft rise, its wraparound porch catching the light. Miles of fencing stretching across golden pasture, cattle moving like slow shadows in the distance. But the beauty of it hit like a punch to the chest because right there beneath it ran the scars. Boards pried loose from the north barn, a tractor missing its tires, a section of corrals half dismantled and leaning like old men too tired to stand. I stopped the truck by the fence line, stepping out into a wind that smelled of sage and dust, and Storm leapt down beside me, his fur ruffling as if the land itself whispered along his spine. We hadn't taken 3 steps before I heard someone behind me clear their throat. "You must be Calder." The voice was soft, almost musical, but steady in a way that made you turn toward it without hesitation. I turned to see a woman about my age, maybe younger, standing by the fence with a coiled lariat hung loosely over one arm. She wore worn jeans tucked into dusty boots, a chambray shirt rolled at the sleeves, and her chestnut hair was tied back in a loose braid that swung down her spine. Her eyes were what caught me, though. Sage green, sharp, watchful, like someone who'd spent her life reading storms as easily as people. "Name's Lila Ward," she said, stepping forward. "Town vet, and someone who cared about your grandmother more than most." Before I could answer, Storm approached her, sniffing her hand with cautious curiosity. Lila knelt, palm open, and the dog leaned into her touch like he'd known her his whole life. She smiled, small and warm, and when she stood again, that smile lingered at the corners of her mouth. "You came a little too late, Calder," she said quietly, gesturing toward the broken corral. "Someone's been picking this place apart piece by piece, selling what he can, hauling off the rest. Says he's family." My jaw tightened. "Darren," she added, reading the question on my face. "Darren Crew. Claims he's some kind of cousin. I don't believe it for a damn second, and Evelyn sure never spoke of him." She looked down, brushing a thumb across the back of her lariat, an emotion that seemed equal parts fidget and memory. "Your grandmother used to tell me stories while I treated her sheepdogs. Always mentioned a grandson she wished she'd known better. Said she hoped he'd come one day." The wind stirred then, carrying with it a faint, lonely groan from the old barn, as if the land itself remembered Evelyn's voice. Lila glanced toward the farmhouse. "Come on. There's something you need to see." She led me and Storm along a narrow path that curved past the house toward a weathered shed tucked beneath a cottonwood tree. The wood was gray from winters and summers alike, but the lock on the door was old, older than the fresh scars on the barn. Lila pulled a key from her pocket. "Evelyn gave this to me the last week she was upright. Told me I'd know when to open it." Inside, the shed was dim and cool, dust motes drifting like tiny spirits in the rays of sunlight slanting through the boards. Storm sniffed along the floorboards, tail low and cautious. Lila moved to a wooden chest along the back wall, one I hadn't noticed at first, carved with the Hartwell brand, H-W. She lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of journals, tied with twine, and beneath them a wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. My chest tightened before I even touched it. Lila handed me the box with a nod. "Open it." Inside were letters, real letters, written in a hand that trembled only toward the end, along with a photograph of my mother when she couldn't have been more than 19, smiling in front of the very porch I had just walked past. Her hair blew across her face in the wind. She looked alive in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. I felt something come apart inside me, quietly, like a knot loosening in the dark. And at that same moment, Storm stiffened, a low growl rippling through him. Lila's eyes snapped to the doorway. "He's here." I turned as a man approached the shed, mid-30s, wiry, with a trimmed beard and dark, restless eyes that flicked over me with quick calculation. He wore a vest too clean for ranch work and jeans that looked like they'd never seen a saddle. "Well," he said, lips curling in a smirk, "looks like the prodigal grandson finally shows up." Lila stepped between us before I could speak. "You don't belong here, Darren." Her voice had steel in it now. "And you?" "Know it." Darren's jaw tightened. "Funny. Got papers that say otherwise." "Forged papers," she shot back. "Evelyn trusted me. She showed me the real will." Darren's gaze darkened as it fell on the box in my hands. "You went through her things?" Lila didn't move. "I protected what she asked me to protect." For a moment the air felt crackle, like lightning, had crawled into the shed and was waiting to choose a target. Storm moved forward, ears back, teeth bared just enough to give any man with sense a warning. Darren stepped back, not far, but enough. "You better watch yourself, Win," he muttered. "This isn't over." Then he turned and stalked away, boots crunching on the gravel. When he disappeared over the rise, Lila exhaled shakily and turned to me, her anger fading into something gentler. "I'm sorry you had to meet him like that. He's been tearing this place apart since Evelyn passed." She reached out, fingers brushing the sleeve of my jacket, light, almost uncertain, but real. "But you're not alone in this. I'll help you. Not for the land, but because your grandmother believed in you. And because She stopped, cheeks coloring softly. "Well, I think you deserve a fresh start." I met her eyes, and for the first time in years something warm stirred in my chest. Small, fragile, but alive. Over the next days, with Lila guiding me through the back roads of Lone Willow, we gathered proof. Pawn shop records, equipment logs, old neighbors who'd watched Darren haul off ranch tools he had no right to touch. Storm became our scout, nosing through the dust of the old barn until he uncovered tarps hiding tagged equipment Evelyn had purchased in her final year. And when the sheriff, an older man named Hank Morris with a slow drawl and eyes that missed nothing, saw the real documents carried in Evelyn's wooden box, he rubbed a hand over his jaw and said, "Looks like we've got ourselves a pretender." Darren was taken into custody by sundown, and when the sun dipped low behind the hills that evening, turning the ranch into a canvas of gold and long shadows, I sat on the steps of the old porch with the last letter from Evelyn spread across my knees. The words blurred more than once as I read them. "My dear grandson, the land I leave you is more than soil and fences. It is a place to grow roots, to heal wounds, to begin again. Do not fear its silence. It has been waiting for you." Lila sat beside me, her hand resting lightly over mine. Storm lay at my feet, eyes half shut as the wind played through his fur. And in that quiet, with the ranch stretching wide and wild around us, I realized I'd gained something I didn't know I was missing. Past, purpose, and maybe, just maybe, a future that no longer felt out of reach. Sometimes God works in ways we do not expect, not through thunder or bright signs, but through quiet moments that shift our path. A letter arriving at the right time, a stranger offering help, a door opening just when we think every one has closed. Calder's journey reminds us that even when we feel lost or forgotten, God can place a light on our road and guide us toward a future we never imagined. In everyday life, we all face fear, doubt, and seasons where we feel like we are walking alone. But miracles often begin with a single step forward, a small act of courage, or the faith to believe that broken things can be rebuilt. Sometimes, God sends us the right people at the right moment, just as he sent Lila into Calder's path. These quiet blessings can be the greatest miracles of all. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be searching for hope. Tell us in the comments what part of the story spoke to you most, and whether you have ever experienced a moment where God helped you through something difficult. Your stories matter, and they help others feel less alone. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you would love to hear more stories like this. May God bless you, watch over your home, and give strength to everyone who listens to these stories.